Welcome to Africa Express. Today we are here in Boston at the African Presidential Archives and Research Center at the Boston University. Our guest today is none other than the Director and former Ambassador to Tanzania, Ambassador Charles Stith. You are welcome to Africa Express, sir.
Thank you. It's good to be with you today.
You are the director, sir, of the APAC Center, which is the African Presidential Archives and Research Center. What does this center do?
We track current trends and developments on the continent, political and economic trends. We focus on primarily 16 countries. Those are countries that, by most observers would conclude that they were serious about democratization and serious about free market reform. Now, the unique twist to what we do, in addition to accessing the same reports that everybody else reads, State Department reports from the foreign ministries of Western nations, NGOs, is that we engage current and former African heads of state. You know, our opinion is that all too often as folks try to figure out what's going on the continent, that it's that voice that is absent in the discussion. So we decided that that was a niche that we could fill. And in response to that, we've created a residency program for former African heads of state. We host current heads of state. As you're aware, we had the president of Malawi, Dr. Bingu wa Mutharika, in September. And he talked about food security. We also produce an African Leaders State of Africa report, which provides a forum for sitting heads of state to give an assessment of what's going on in their country, what's going on in their region and on the continent. And we do a distribution of that report that is global, both to public and private sector leaders, thought leaders, and opinion makers.
I noticed that you only select democratically elected presidents to come here. Why is it?
Well, again, having looked at the continent, at where it's been, where it is, and where it's going, we concluded that the current period in the history of modern Africa, and probably for the next 20 years or so, is the second most important period in the history of the continent. The first, obviously, is the liberation era. And for leadership of that era, the critical question was, how do we get our countries back? Since the dispensation in South Africa in 1994, the question has changed. And it's now that we have our countries back, how do we make them work? And we've concluded that there are a number of leaders on the continent who get the second question. And they're leaders, by and large, who understand that the future of their country is going to be secured and furthered if they deal with democratization, free, transparent elections, and systems of governance that allow the people to hold leadership accountable. They're leaders who've also come to the conclusion that if their countries and their people are going to fulfill their potential, that they need to institute economic reforms that will enable free market economies to grow. So it's for that reason, or those two reasons, that we focus on the 16 countries that we track, and it's for that reason that we engage the leaders from those countries.
I'm going to deviate a bit to media. In your paper written, you wrote a paper, and it basically says that the coverage of Africa in the media, overall of it, is negative. and this was in 2005. Has anything changed since then? We are in 2011.
Well, let me back up a bit and talk a little bit more about what we found. It was not just that the coverage was negative, it was overwhelmingly negative. We tracked coverage of the continent over a 10-year period, a longitudinal study, and it might well be the only, I know it was the only one done up until the time that we did ours, and it might quite frankly be the only one that's been done. We looked at major media outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the U.S. News and World Report, the Wall Street Journal, and we looked at their coverage from 1994 to 2004. We chose 94 because that was the year of the dispensation of South Africa, and we assumed that if there was anything that was positive on the continent, certainly that transition in South Africa was. So we saw that as a good starting point to begin the analysis. What we discovered was that 94.6% of the coverage of the continent of Africa was distinctly and decidedly negative. Unfortunately, and we've not yet done a follow-up study, and we might well do that sometime in the near future. But observationally, not much has changed. I think the thing that we contributed to in terms of the understanding of how Africa is covered is to make people more sensitive to it. The good news is, while the media has not gotten as fair and balanced, and that's what I would call it, despite the fact that they haven't gotten as fair and balanced as we think they ought to be, more and more folks are beginning to look at Africa and to begin to look at it in its full breadth, and that is the good, the bad, and the ugly. Our position is that only the bad and ugly has been covered in the past, yes, and absent the good. We've seen since our study publications like that by Charlene Hunter Galt, whose book is titled The Good News Out of Africa. She's a former CNN bureau chief based in Johannesburg. Vijay Mahajan out of the University of Texas. He teaches at their business school. Has done a nice book titled Africa Rising. So we're starting to see more and more a focus on not just the negatives, but also the positives. Most recently, the McKinsey Group did a study on Africa, again highlighting why it's an attractive venue for investors. So we're starting to see a transition. It's not as quick or complete as we think it ought to be. And I would say, not simply because we're doing the interview, that shows like yours take on an added importance in giving people a sense of the other side of Africa, because there's a lot going on.
Yes.
Despite the current downturn in the global economy since 2008, Africa is one of the regions of the world where they're still racking up significant rates of return on investment. The rate of growth, while not in double digits as it was prior to the global recession, is still in the high single figures.
Is it possible that it is just a Western problem? Because media outlet like Al Jazeera, when you watch Al Jazeera seem to be more objective. Where when they're covering a country, they show both positive, negative, but then when you watch the Western media, they seem to portray and distort things. So I'm thinking whether it's more of a Western problem in terms of the way they do the coverage, whereas
well, I'd say the Western coverage is probably worse in a quantitative and qualitative sense. And if for no other reason than Western sources tend to be the sources of record more often than not. I mean, people watch worldwide CNN. People watch BBC worldwide. The New York Times, the Washington Post publish worldwide through the International Herald Tribune. Magazines like Time, Newsweek, Business Week, etc. The Bloomberg channel, Sky News. I mean, they tend to dominate the media, so their impact is exponentially greater. But having said that, I tend to watch the English version of Al Jazeera, and quite frankly, I don't think coverage on Al Jazeera is as positive as it needs to be. And I'd go further, that I think to some extent, even media sources on the continent have internalized this negative image of Africa. When you look at the daily papers in South Africa, there tends to be more bad news about Africa than good news. So it really, there's this, what I call an orthodoxy about Africa that is patently pessimistic, and it seems to define the continent. And again, it's why shows like yours are so important. And I would add that I think it's important that the leadership in Africa understand more fully the power of the media and the importance of them controlling their brand.
And there goes my next question, is the African Union. Do they owe an obligation to the continent to launch a positive media campaign? Do you think they do?
Well, I think the African Union, certainly, I think the African Union as a body, which includes 50, I think it's 52 members, yes. And because it represents the continent in so many ways, certainly ought to see this as a part of the portfolio of its programs, policies, and objectives. But having said that, I mean, the African Union as a body has its own problems. You know, as I said, we track 16 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. There are 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So it means that the significant portion of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which are AU members, have not just image problems, they've got problems relative to governance. They've got problems in terms of how their economies are organized and how they function. So it gets kind of difficult. I mean, a case in point, a couple of years ago, Muammar Gaddafi, bless his heart, was the chairman of the African Union. And he decided he wanted to make his cause the United States of Africa. Well, the immediate problem that you run into with somebody like Gaddafi as an advocate for a United States of Africa is his vision of how a United States of Africa would run, similar to the vision he has for Libya, which doesn't work. I mean, you've got a government which is totally unaccountable to the people, and that's not the future. Having said that...
Though it is a good idea.
I think it's an excellent idea. I think it's an excellent idea.
Initiated by a wrong person.
But by the wrong person. I think that the continent, the brands have to be managed until you get an effective continental entity. You know, Tanzania needs to be serious about how its country is branded and how its image is projected. Ghana needs to be serious about its brand and how it's projected. South Africa did a very good job during the Olympics. I mean, the World Cup. Did a very good job during the World Cup. And it turned it a bit in terms of how people looked at that country. But on a country-by-country basis, the leadership has to understand that if they're going to provide an attractive venue for investment, if they're going to be an attractive venue for tourists, that they've got to do a better job of managing their brands. Money, cash, is a coward, doesn't like to go places where things are unsettled. Tourist, when you're saving your money, to take a trip somewhere, you want to be reasonably sure that you're going to get in and out safely, that you're not going to be a potential victim for a carjacking or a kidnapping, that there is going to be a complex of health services and a concern around issues of health and sanitation, so that you don't wind up getting sick. So, these are the sorts of things that have to happen on a country-by-country basis.
So your stand is that it should happen country by country, not the continent as a whole.
I think it's difficult to do. I think it's difficult to do a continent as a whole. Quite frankly, Tanzania doesn't want to be looked at, side by side with the Côte d'Ivoire. Ghana doesn't want to be lumped together with the Togo. The Mozambique doesn't want to be perceived as being cut from the same cloth as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Because those countries have some serious problems that you can't ignore or you can't spin away. On the other hand, a country like Tanzania does have a lot to offer. They're in their sixth cycle of multi-party elections. The country is stable. There's a lot going on in terms of economic development. They don't want to be lumped together with the Democratic Republic of the Congo. South Africa, the same thing. It's a vibrant economy, the sophisticated markets. A leader on the continent and a leader in the world. They don't want to be lumped together with a Togo or Côte d'Ivoire. So, therein lies the problem with the continental, or quite frankly, even a regional approach to trying to rebrand the continent.
Do you see any challenge in Africa obtaining democracy as a continent?
Well, the short answer is I think the continent is trending in the right direction. When we started the center almost 10 years ago, we tracked only 13 countries. Today, it's 16. And more countries are struggling with what it means to form and fashion a democracy and free and transparent elections and the creation of democratic institutions. And I believe that number is going to increase over the years. Furthermore, I'd say that the countries we track, I think, should be and should see themselves as anchor states. I mean, the bad news is that there are only 16 countries, which is about a third of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The good news is those 16 countries are the most heavily populated. So about 2/3 of the people in sub-Saharan Africa live in those countries. So that means that every day, most Africans wake up in a country where they have some say-so about who leads that country and their means to hold their leadership accountable. That's the good news. And with inventions like the cell phone, the internet, what happens in one country is almost instantaneously available to the citizens in other countries. And people are measuring. They're measuring the responsiveness of their governments. They're measuring the conduct of their elected officials or their anointed officials or appointed officials over against the kind of the leadership and the quality of leadership that they're seeing in other places. And so our sense is that the continent is trending toward democratization. There's a push from the grassroots level. And I think that you're going to see more in the way of a push from countries around the continent, insisting that their neighbors get their act together. We've seen in a number of cases where Africans have begun to take the bull by the horn, so to speak, and move things forward. The power sharing agreement in Kenya, while not perfect, it represents an African response to an African problem. I mean, Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, received the lion's share of credit because he was the most visible. But the former president of Tanzania, Benjamin Mkapa, was the day-to-day guy helping to keep this thing moving. And at the end, the current president, Jakaya Kikwete, helped get the ball over the goal line. Earlier, we saw the intervention by the African leaders in Liberia. They got Charles Taylor to abdicate. And while I'm on the subject, I think it's regrettable that he's being tried at the Hague. I know that's somewhat controversial. And it's not that he shouldn't be tried. It's not that he didn't commit acts that were criminal. The problem is that in negotiating him out of office, despite having to hold their noses, agreeing to provide him a safe haven in Nigeria, is the best path to trying to get some of these folks that shouldn't be in office out of office. And there are precedents for this sort of thing. I mean, look, if the world had wanted to, Ian Smith, the former head of then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, certainly could have been prosecuted for crimes against humanity. But the world concluded that it was in Rhodesia/Zimbabwe's best interest, in the region's best interest, in the continent's best interest, to get this guy to go quietly into the night, facilitate the kind of transition that empowered the people of Zimbabwe to fashion their own sense of governance. We don't live in a perfect world, so there are not going to be many perfect solutions.
So in a sense, you're saying that Charles Taylor, that him being tried at the Hague is basically putting him, glorifying what he did? Or?
Well, it's not glorifying. It's not glorifying what he did. What it does is it makes it more difficult, for example, to negotiate a guy like Robert Mugabe out of office. I mean, if the choice is, fight tooth and nail to stay in, or leave and then be tried by a tribunal in The Hague, facing life imprisonment, for a dictator, I'm not a genius, but that seems like a pretty easy choice. You stay, and you fight tooth and nail to stay. And ultimately, nobody wins in that situation. And so, we've got to be willing to not let the pursuit for the perfect get in the way of the good and the acceptable.
During your tenure in Tanzania, let's talk a little bit about you. You did a lot of work to bring U.S. and Tanzania relationship you improved it, if I would say. What are some of the things that you did for Tanzania and U.S.?
Well, first of all, let me say I was honored to have been selected by President Clinton to be the United States ambassador to Tanzania. And at the point of the selection and appointment, clearly there was no way to anticipate that the circumstances under which I would be going would be as traumatic as they wound up being with the bombing of the embassy.
Yes.
I was confirmed by the Senate 1 month before Al-Qaeda bombed the embassy, and I went 1 month after that. So there was no way to anticipate that. But I would also add, and I think it's important to add, that I was the ambassador. In terms of decision making from the U.S. side, the buck stopped with me as the president's in-country representative. But I was fortunate and blessed to have a very good a team of Foreign Service professionals as a part of the country team. And we were fortunate and blessed to have the willing partner in the Tanzanian government, which we did. Benjamin Mkapa had served as Tanzania's ambassador to the United States, so he was familiar with our country and how it moves. Jakaya Kikwete, the current president, was then foreign minister. He was equally as savvy. And so with partners like that, I think we were able to do a lot. One, we were able to help Tanzania increase its capacity to deal with catastrophic events. God forbid there be another bombing, but there are catastrophes. There are train wrecks, there are storms and floods, and we saw as a result of the challenges in the aftermath of the bombing that they could use some help in enhancing their capacity to deal with those sort of events. So we were all too pleased to be able to be helpful. David Satcher, who was our Surgeon General, was one of the first people to visit Tanzania. We look for ways to do trade and investment. And William Daley, who was then the Secretary of Commerce, came to Tanzania at my request. And I was actually in a meeting the other day at the U.S. Trade Representative's office, and I didn't know this, but William Daley, Clinton's Secretary of Commerce, was the last U.S. Secretary of Commerce to visit the continent. And that's over 10 years ago, and that's unfortunate. Likewise, President Clinton also came over, Secretary of Transportation Rodney Slater. We signed, while I was there, the first Open Skies Agreement between the United States and an African country. We were able to get Tanzania positioned as the first African country to qualify for debt relief under the HIPC initiative. And we broke ground for a brand new embassy, one of the most beautiful, I think that's an appropriate word, beautiful and functional new embassies anywhere in the world. So we were fortunate in the 2.5 years I was there to get quite a bit accomplished.
Well, Ambassador Stith, we want to thank you so much for the work that you are doing here at the Presidential Center, and the work that you've done in Africa and that you continue to do in Africa. Is people like you that are out there advocating for Africa, making sure that what needs to be done is done. Again, we thank you so much for being on Africa Express. Please do stay tuned and continue to watch us on this channel, same time, and thank you.